All right. Should we get started?
It's 12:02. I think we're ready to go. And then as people join in, that's absolutely fine.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming for our first faculty spotlight series today. We've got Dr. Laurie Benton joining us to discuss complex trauma and juvenile delinquency. Dr. Benton is an associate professor here at the Chicago School in our forensic department. She's been with us for 17 years. So our longest running faculty here in our department. She is quite the expert in trauma. And so that's what she'll be talking about today. In addition to being an associate professor here at the Chicago School, Dr. Benton has private practice that she sees families, children, adults with general mental health concerns. She also sees forensic clients and does a lot of other work that I'm sure she'll touch on at some point during the presentation, including work with individuals who are working as attorneys, paralegals for immigration proceedings. I don't offhand know everything. Dr. Benton can share that. But yes, so thank you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Dr. Benton.
All right, thank you, Dr. Belmonte, for that introduction. Thank you for inviting me to the Spotlight series, this Lunch and Learn. I'm very excited to have a little bit of your time here today to talk about a topic that I'm very interested in, very passionate about over the years, and that is complex trauma and pathways to juvenile delinquency. And I will share my screen. All right, can everybody see my screen? All right, these phrases that now are just commonly part of our language that a few years back we never had to say before, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit here on this topic and then try to leave a little bit of time for questions, and discussion at the end. It's a little bit hard for me to monitor the chat while I'm talking because I only see a small bar of you, but I will definitely take a look at that as I can. Okay. All right, let me get you the big view here. There we go. All right, so just to piggyback a little bit on Dr. Belmonte's introduction, yes, I've been with the faculty for 17 years, and my specialty area in forensic psychology is particularly working with children and families who are court involved or court ordered, usually somewhere in the reunification process. So these are children often that have been separated or removed from their homes due to abuse and neglect, and are somewhere in that reunification process. But as you heard Dr. Belmonte say, I also do a lot of general clinical practice with children and families and adults. I also have a position within the Department of Child and Family Services here in Illinois in their integrated assessment program. And there I'm working with, that's within our child welfare program, completing comprehensive evaluations of our families in care. These evaluations go to court to help inform decisions related to reunification, service needs, all sorts of things. And of course, I do a lot of teaching here. Some of my favorite subjects are the trauma-related courses that I teach, but also I do practicum seminars. I do a lot of therapy. I'm a psychotherapist, and I really enjoy mentoring students as they too begin to understand themselves as clinicians. All right. So let's start our talk with just talking a little bit about what is trauma. So trauma is an event that's perceived to be distressing beyond your ability to cope. And it often involves emotional, cognitive, behavioral, social, and spiritual responses. So one thing I like to emphasize here in the beginning is what makes a traumatic event is right here, this important word perceived. So it is the meaning that we make of the event, not the event itself. We're all familiar with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And this is a particular DSM-5 diagnosis that entered the DSM in 1980. And in 1980, there were two lines of research, very, very important research that were coming together and converging. It was our research on our combat veterans and our research on our sexual assault survivors or rape survivors. So you had, on one hand, a group of research looking at combat neuroses of war, and a group of research looking at what they were calling rape trauma syndrome. And if you look into this old research, you'll see those terms used. Anyway, this research converged. They realized much of what they were studying in these two groups of people were very similar. And so in 1980, they created the post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. And it was very much sort of describing survivors of traumatic events, sort of acute traumatic events, disasters, single accidents, motor vehicle accidents, things like that. So what we've found across now this arc of PTSD being in the DSM is that post-traumatic stress disorder didn't capture the trauma experience of a large group of people, including many of the individuals that I work with. And so we started researching this notion of complex trauma. And if you look in the literature, there are multiple labels for this phenomenon. You'll see it called disorders of extreme stress, not otherwise specified. You'll see developmental trauma disorder, complex PTSD, of course, complex trauma. And these are all referring to the same phenomena. And here I have it defined. I'm just moving you guys out of the way there for you. So there's a couple parts to this definition of complex trauma that are particularly important. So it's an experience of multiple chronic and prolonged developmentally adverse traumatic events and interpersonal nature, and usually with an early life onset. And I'm going to show you a couple more slides now. There's been people doing research since this Vanderkolk 2005 publication, and this definition for complex trauma has remained pretty stable over time. And so the point here, the pieces that make it different from PTSD. So we're looking at multiple chronic and prolonged traumatic events. And that they are interpersonal in nature. And much of what we look at with complex trauma, we're looking at caregivers. You know, what is going on between youth and our caregivers? And that when we say interpersonal in nature, that's what we're really talking about. The last piece is early life. We're particularly interested in when the adverse and traumatic experiences begin early in life and repetitive and patterned over time. And I'll explain why that's very important to understand in a bit. So this is, like I said, I'm just showing you how this definition has remained pretty consistent over time. This is Courtois and Ford in 2009. And you guys can take a look at this slide, repetitive, prolonged. You have, again, developmentally vulnerable times beginning early, and at the hands of caregivers and responsible adults. Now, the piece that we're going to talk about a lot today is that because these experiences are repetitive and patterned over time, they do disrupt a youth's development. And this is Ford and Courtois. They just switched. In the one publication, it was Courtois first author, Ford second. Now they just switched. But again, they've written a textbook, and the definition here of complex trauma remained very consistent. So when we think about complex trauma and what contributes to the deficits or the impairments that we're going to see, the ACE study becomes very important to understand. So the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study came out of particular research that was being done by Dr. Anda out of the CDC and Dr. Felitti out of Kaiser Permanente Medical Center. And these two doctors joined forces and were researching a treatment for obesity. And what they realized is as their patients progressed in the treatment and started to do better, so had dramatic weight loss, their medical consequences that were connected to their obesity started to lessen, so they had better medical outcomes. What they realized is a lot of those clients dropped out, or when they started to do very well, they started to do worse again and gain weight. Well, this kind of piqued their interest because they took a particular look at 17,000 of these adults and realized that when they did retrospective interviewing to kind of try to understand this trend, that majority of these adults endorsed adverse childhood experiences. And so they began to take a closer look at this. And you have here on your screen what is considered the adverse childhood experiences. And you can see it expands how we think about child and adolescent trauma. Now, think about this. This study came out around the mid to late 90s. And just to put a framework in place, there were not state or federal mandates, child protection mandates, until 1990. So, you know, when you sit down with your clients and you say, hey, if you reveal that you're being abused, that we have to mandated reporting, that didn't exist until 1990. And so now you have a bunch of sort of scientific literature coming out that shows, oh my gosh, look at the negative impact that adverse childhood experiences can have. Just to kind of put it in that framework, it was the late 90s. So this study, particularly when they looked at ACEs, expanded how we think about childhood abuse and neglect and trauma. And they found out that these ACEs were linked to 9 out of the 10 leading causes of death in the United States. This study, the ACE study, has now been repeated in multiple places in the United States and across the world now. And the results stay remarkably consistent. And if you have an ACE score of 4 or more, your chances of the 9 leading causes of death in the United States, plus psychosocial impairment, mental health problems, skyrocket. So this became very important in understanding complex trauma and the types of experiences that contribute to the behaviors that we're going to see in complex trauma. What the ACE study helped us appreciate is it's just not a child incubated or immersed in adversity and bad things, grows up seeing bad things, so they do bad things. We now have an appreciation that there's a real neurobiological mechanism operating that actually changes, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute, the actual structure and function of the brain. So we need this diagnosis, and here are some reasons why. Certainly, it will help us better understand the clinical presentation of children and adolescents that present to us with chronic interpersonal trauma. It's going to help us develop effective evidence-based interventions, direct our research, and obviously more accurate diagnosis. Now, here's the thing. If you take me for this class or you see me do trainings that are a little bit extended in time, I do an exercise because I don't believe we're all running around out there misdiagnosing youth. We are trying to use the current nomenclature to capture the complexity of this diagnosis. But certainly, if we had a complex trauma diagnosis, it probably would be a bit more accurate. So I like to talk about domains of impact with complex trauma. So what we're going to do right now is we're moving in, and I want you to think of these as domains of development for adolescents. And now we're going to look at the impact of these repetitive, prolonged early experiences of trauma and adversity for children. So the first domain I like to look at is attachment, relationship. And what you'll see with our youth that have complex trauma is their attachments are often insecure or disorganized. And you see a youth that could be avoidant, helpless, disconnected from others. Some youth will lack empathy and understanding for others. Very guarded and cautious in relationships. But relationships then can appear superficial. But we also have the problem on the other end too, which is you can have the numbed out, sort of avoidant, distant youth, but you can also have the clingy need. I don't like these terms necessarily, but they do facilitate some description, but perhaps an overly dependent, clingy attachment style. Okay. Now, one of the important things to understand when you're working with a complex trauma survivor is oftentimes they are replaying in their current relationships remnants, patterns that are reminiscent of those early abusive and adverse experiences. And this is locked away from their consciousness. So you have youth sort of reenacting in their current relationships, these patterns, but quite outside of their conscious awareness. Okay. The second domain is biology. And we know with our adolescents who have surviving complex trauma that they have a lot of somatic and medical problems. They can have stomach aches, headaches, digestion concerns. So many times the trauma is so prolonged and pervasive, it's often speechless. So there's no real story around it or coherent story. So a lot of times the trauma finds its place in the body. I like to talk about affect regulation and behavioral control together for our youth with complex trauma. One of the consequences is you have difficulty, noticing emotional changes in your body, then being able to conjure up a word for that, and then also being able to talk to somebody about that. And so affect regulation and the ability to use relationships to help manage feelings is impacted. I'm going to come back to dissociation in a little bit. Behavioral control. Well, what do we know about youth that have trouble managing their feelings? They get discharged into their behavior. And so you can see youth that have difficulty with managing their behavior, their impulses, thinking before acting, those kind of things. With our kids with complex trauma, their cognitive skills are impacted. And so you'll see intentional concentration deficits, executive functioning. What's executive functioning? The ability to plan, to be thoughtful, think through things, kind of use your brain and your intellect and not your gut. You know, when you think about people who are just like, I go by my gut. That's a very emotionally driven sort of way of making decisions. Whereas, we hope by adolescence, young adulthood, we know this is an ever evolving skill, but we hope that executive functioning, that ability to hit the pause button, think through, wonder about what happened in the past. How are you going to make this decision now and in the future? We're hoping those skills start to come on board, but it's impaired with kids with complex trauma. Another domain of impact is self-concept. Our youth with complex trauma often have poor or low self-esteem. Their senses of self start to kind of be sort of encrusted with this sense of I'm worthless. And when I say encrusted, because it can be hard to penetrate, inflexible. When your sense of self has a little bit of permeability and flexibility, it can change. Our youth will come with these sort of hardened sense of I'm worthless, I'm inadequate, undesirable, flawed. And this is a very important point of intervention at some point, because these are the things that we'll talk in a little bit, make our youth vulnerable to pathways to unlawful behavior. All right, so let me check the time. Oh, hold on. There we go. Okay, doing pretty good here. All right, so now keep in mind what we just talked about and all those domains of impact and all those behaviors that an adolescent can show us if they've sort of been immersed in this complex trauma. Now we're going to talk about the neurobiological mechanisms that are guiding that. And this is where our state-of-the-art science and neuroimaging has really helped us understand complex trauma, because we have pictures of the brain that support what I'm about to show you. Okay, so I'm going to get my pointer out here. All right, so in a typical youth brain, the brain is developing always in every experience from the bottom up. So from the brainstem through the middle brain, limbic system, and the neocortex. So from the bottom up and the inside out. And what typically happens, let's say even right now, for you guys sitting here listening to me rattle on about this, information is coming in from the outside. So your sensory organs are bringing information in, but you're also getting information from your internal system that you're not even aware of. Your heart rate, your respiration, some stuff you become aware of because now maybe you're getting overheated. So information is always flowing in from the outside and internally. And it's coming in through the brainstem first. And each step along the process, this information gets processed a little bit more, so that by the time you get, hey, she just mentioned something about the amygdala, you have been processing that piece of information all the way from the bottom up, inside out, when the neocortex gets it, and you can start thinking about it. Now, in a typically developing brain, that happens over and over and over again in a use-dependent, patterned way. And that way, the brain begins to communicate with itself in a very smooth and organized manner. The brain functions in an integrated fashion. And so you have a youth that's able to do all those things in decision-making and planning and managing affect and controlling behavior. Okay, typical. Let's talk about what happens over time with complex trauma. Touchy screen here. So what happens with complex trauma is so you have a youth who's immersed in adversity and trauma. And so there's a constant field of unsafety out there. And so the child is having to navigate a lack of safety. And what we see in neuroimaging studies is the part of the brain that becomes I sort of like to say, always humming in the background. The part of the brain that tends to be in the driver's seat is the part of the brain that is going to be helpful in helping the child survive. And this is called the survivor brain. And I'm going to try to circle it the best I can here, but it goes from the limbic system through the middle brain, down to the brainstem. Okay. So for our complex trauma survivors, this part of the survivor brain is the one that's in the driver's seat. And this is what happens over time. When this part of the survivor brain is the one in the driver's seat, it causes a lack of integration and organization with the rest of the brain. And so you have a brain that's not communicating with itself like it should. So how does this happen? Okay. Same thing happens. Information's coming in from the internal world of the child and the outside from our sensory organs. But this child has been reinforced to find threat. And so the information comes into the amygdala. And if the amygdala determines threat, the amygdala sends a message to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus sends a message to the pituitary gland to signal our adrenal glands to start this cascade of neurochemical reactions of adrenaline and cortisol that races across our organ systems. And yes, this is the HPA axis, and this is the fight or flight response. And so when this is happening, this full body response to threat, there's a couple other things that are happening in the brain. Cortisol and adrenaline are blocking the thalamus, inhibiting the thalamus and inhibiting the hippocampus. What does this mean? Well, the thalamus is the messenger to the brain. And so it's going to take information and pass it to that neocortex where it can be used and associated and thought about. The hippocampus takes information from our short-term memory into our long-term memory, where we can remember it, conjure it up and think about it, and where we can learn from it. Now, if you are walking home and you get mugged one night, and that happens, and your system ignites, your fight or flight goes off, and all this stuff is happening, this is great because it's going to get you safe. But the problem is, with our kids who are being immersed and incubated in adversity and trauma and within their homes, it's not like that. So the threat never truly dissipates. And so you have a brain that's constantly wired for threat. You have a brain whose thalamus is inhibited chronically, whose hippocampus is inhibited chronically. This is why you have youth who have trouble with attention, concentration, learning, decision-making, planning. And you have a threat response system that's always humming in the background. Now, the consequences of this for our kids is the triggers for what's unsafe and dangerous and threatening become more subtle and more generalized and more subtle and more generalized. And so you have a child who has just this real sensitive system to pick up any type of threat and will be responding almost unconsciously and automatically through the survivor brain. And so this is some of the wiring. Now, here's the important thing I want to emphasize. Now we know our complex trauma survivors, the structure of their brain. So the actual anatomical structure of the brain, as well as the function of the brain, changes as it relates to this process. Okay, I see chat. Let me see. Oops, okay, never mind. I think that was more a technical question with the, okay, thank you. All right, so just as a bit of a review and adding in what the polyvagal system has brought to our understanding of our complex survivors and their neurobiological system. We now know that the sympathetic nervous systems in our children are activated to engage in the fight or flight and get safe. However, we now know that the parasympathetic nervous system, particularly the activation of the vagal nerve and the dorsal vagal system, is engaged for immobilization and disconnection to get safe. And the reason this is important for our youth, our children who become adolescents, become adults, is because if you are immersed in a situation where the trauma is inescapable, the sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, so you're going to try to fight it and you're going to try to run away. But if this is your home and you're 8, you can't do either one of those because you're little, you're small, you can't fight it off. And if you ran away, you wouldn't survive. And so you're caught in this situation where your nervous system has to figure out, how do you survive and exist in a system that's threatening, but yet you need for survival? And that's where this parasympathetic nervous system, the polyvagal system, and the dorsal pathway help youth. Again, it's a survival strategy, just like the fight or flight, helps youth disconnect, numb out, anesthetize themselves. So this is where you hear youth having dissociative symptoms because they literally, to survive, immobilize. All right. Again, these pathways and these ways of dealing with threat become reinforced and entrenched and somewhat inflexible in complex trauma survivors. So this is just a picture to show you what we got going. And I should be just about at 12:30, good. So the stress response system, here you got it in a typical, here's a little boy, he's immersed in a family here that they're arguing. You hear the fight or flight ignites. all these systems, all these reactions are mobilized to get safe. If the threat is removed, acetylcholine is released, and you have all this fight or flight response decrease, and the youth can go on and feel sort of a calm, connected, regulated state. But as I just said, most of the youth that I work with, and even adults who are survivors, don't experience that. They're in a repetitive, prolonged situation where the traumatic and adverse experiences are happening over and over again. So they must figure out how to survive in this dorsal vagal state, which is disconnected and dissociated. And again, as I said, this creates a nervous system very sensitive to threat. All right. So what does this mean for our youth? Well, it means their brains are not going to be, their brains and themselves are not going to be organized for exploration, curiosity, relatedness. It's going to be harder for our youth with complex trauma to take advantage of relationships with friends, with families, with other adults, to engage in the world through those relationships in ways that, lead to health and growth and all the things that we like to see. Instead, they are oriented to survive. Okay. So how do we make this link with delinquency? Okay, well, let's try to do that in a little bit of time that we have, because I want to see if you have questions and discussion too. So delinquent behavior, we know, is associated with conduct disorder, and conduct disorder is a DSM-5 disorder that involves the violation of the rights of others. Some of those examples are like fighting and stealing, and also the violation of age-based societal norms. Oops. Okay, here's just some stats to think about the link between complex trauma and delinquency. We know that children exposed to violence are more likely to abuse drugs and alcohol, suffer from depression and anxiety, have perhaps PTSD, problems in school, and all of these that I just named and others create vulnerabilities for youth to engage in unlawful behavior. Now, interestingly enough, we know that this came out of a couple studies. The Abrams study is from 2004, is a long time ago, but these results have been repeated. So I like to sometimes talk about some of these hallmark studies of our juveniles. So the Abrams study in 2004 showed that 92.5% of youth have experienced at least one trauma. 92.5% of our youth in juvenile justice. 84% of our youth in juvenile justice have experienced more than one. And more than half have been exposed to 6 or more times with a mean of 14.6 traumatic incidences in their life. So this was a study that took a population of youth who were in the juvenile justice system. And these were some of the statistics that came out of that study in 2004. Now remember our time frame, 1990, child reporting mandate, late 90s, ACE studies started to become on the scene. Early 2000s, it kind of got a little bit more traction. Here's another very important study that linked complex trauma and delinquency. The NCTSN, Dirk Heising in 2013 took a look at rates of delinquency and trauma, and this was their results. So an average of 4.9 different trauma types. So that's like, they just endorsed not how many times, but I was physically abused once. I was sexually abused once. Or I'm sorry, I was physically abused. I was sexually abused. It doesn't account for incident, just the actual type. And you can see what was the percentages there around their experiences. So we now have these large research studies showing the link, that the vulnerability that's created when you have a complex trauma history to youth who then go on and struggle with unlawful behavior. But, you know, I like to talk about it this way rather than these big studies. I mean, the studies, we should know them. We should know the results because they really did help garner a lot of attention to a group of youth that really needs support and resources. But I like to go back to those domains of impact and talk a little bit about why, when you see youth who have a complex trauma history and they have those domains across their developmental domains, they have those impairments. And now we know there's real neurobiological mechanisms that are causing those things or correlated with those things. Well, let's take a look back at these domains. So self-concept, like if a youth sees themselves as unworthy, as flawed, as unlovable, as I said before, this is going to create a vulnerability to certain types of thoughts, feelings, reactions, and behaviors that can open a youth up to engage in the types of behaviors that could catch the attention of those involved in the juvenile justice field. Under the cognitive domain of impact, trauma interferes with information processing. And if that's happening, as you heard me say, decision-making, judgment, insight are all going to be potentially impaired. And we now, when we work with our youth in the juvenile justice and juvenile justice that have trauma histories, we know one of the things that we want to work with them on is being able to improve their problem solving and also their way that they think about the events in their life. So it's hard to problem solve and think ahead or reflect back on your previous behavior to wonder about or think about planning for now or the future if you are a present-oriented, safety-oriented human being, right? So if you are oriented to threat and staying safe, this is not a place where you do a lot of lofty problem solving and thinking through things. And so we want to help our youth. This is a place of intervention. How do we calm the nervous system down so we can unlock and work on some of these problem solving, judgment, insight issues? This is one of the ones that I train a lot on and present on, the attachment domain. Just like complex trauma happened over time in a repetitive way in relationships, the only way it heals is through repetitive, patterned, over time, corrective experiences in safe, nurturing relationships. And so this is very difficult because a youth may come to you oriented to not trust. And a youth may come to you with disruptions in their ability to empathize. Now, why is this a link with perhaps unlawful behavior? Well, if you don't trust people because you feel like they're out to get you, and you can't put yourself in their shoes, or you're not going to, your tendency to perhaps violate the rights of others and not feel the weight emotionally or cognitively of those decisions is higher. So you might be able to do that and not suffer the weight of as much guilt, shame, or perhaps there's a cognitive piece in here too. Even sometimes when you do bad things, you behave in ways that you shouldn't, you ruminate around it. And so sometimes our youth with complex trauma and delinquency struggle in those areas, but it's all points of intervention. Okay. Of course, we've talked a lot about the neurobiological domain. When you have a youth who's either in the dorsal vagal, numbed out, immobilized, disconnected state, or a youth who's sympathetically driven and is active and engaged in fight or flight, this is a youth who's going to be acting to protect themselves. And if you are sensitive to threat, and you are, there is something that can happen where you actually see it maybe where it doesn't exist. And so hostile attribution bias is something that our youth will demonstrate. They see threat where there might not be threat, and they react to it to get safe and protect themselves. And that can create, obviously, a pathway to unlawful behavior. Affect regulation and behavioral control. We know that our youth with difficulties managing their feelings and monitoring their behavior may engage in substance abuse and other risky behaviors. And often, as I stated a little bit before, it's hard for our youth with complex trauma and delinquency sometimes to see themselves very far into the future. A future-oriented brain is not one that's going to be sort of that heat-seeking radar for threat. And so, again, our kids are a lot of times present moment oriented. How do I get through this present moment and stay safe? So the experience of complex trauma also violates the social contract that lies at the heart of societal law and structures. And so for a lot of our kids, they feel like, hey, this world that was lined up that everybody told me I was going to get access to, I didn't. It didn't feel like good deeds and behavior are going to have the same impact on me as they did maybe for somebody else. And so they just, sometimes our youth will have a way of justifying the ways that they engage in unlawful behavior. Also, our youth with complex trauma that find themselves in the juvenile justice system are experiencing the weight, the additional weight, and how that impacts them emotionally, behaviorally, and interpersonally of oppression, discrimination, and marginalization related to their race, their gender, status, their poverty status, and oftentimes the communities where they reside. And so this becomes an additional vulnerability or sensitivity for our youth as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop here in a second because this presentation told you all the parts of the sort of focus on, hey, this is how all the things can go wrong. But we know that your youth are also resilient. They're surviving, so there's resilience, and they're also building in strength. And one way that we do that is through intervention. And so since the early 2000s to now, people like myself that practice providing, therapy and other services to youth, as well as researchers who said, okay, how can we best help? We know a lot about this situation. How can we help? And here's some ideas. And we know that we can help. We know that we can intervene and make an impact. And so all intervention begins with a very good comprehensive clinical assessment. What flows from that clinical assessment is information that helps you conceptualize or understand the youth and develop a treatment plan. Now, with complex trauma in our juvenile justice youth, we are going to be looking at perhaps taking trauma-informed approaches, and there are now wonderfully researched and also implemented evidence-based trauma-informed approaches to our youth with complex trauma that find themselves in the juvenile justice program, our juvenile justice system. We also, with all our complex trauma survivors and youth, and especially those that find themselves in the juvenile justice system, we want to focus on connection and co-regulation. The relationship will always be the primary importance here in treatment. So I always tell my students, therapy is not about coming into a session and figuring out what you're going to do to your clients so that they get better. So working with our youth is about connection, co-regulation, the relationship, and all the things that then unfold through that. Now we also appreciate that we need to be doing things, not just talk therapy. Talk therapy is always going to be important, but that now we're going to start introducing approaches that really help our youth calm or regulate that neurobiological system. So things like yoga, music, relaxation, deep breathing. I have clients that I've referred for massage. We're also going to be working on building in the skill building that our youth might have not received when they deserved it because they were in an abusive, adverse environment. So we've got to think about how do we build in those skills that they didn't get probably when they deserved it, but now they're in treatment, they're with us. And for us, we must take care of ourselves and also build in our own self-regulation so that our self-care, our wellness, our self-regulation can be something that our youth can benefit from in the therapeutic relationship. And I always tell my students that work with me, when you're working with kids and youth, you must collaborate and you must work to form a collaborative and cooperative treatment alliance with other people in the kid's life. So you'll want to work with probation officers, you want to work with teachers, you want to work with coaches, you want to work with pediatricians, and hopefully all of us working together around a shared understanding of what the youth needs, as well as the youth, a big part of that, we can be helpful. All right. I think that concludes my race through that material. Be more than happy to stop here in the last few minutes and discuss anything with you. I'll stop sharing. Any questions, comments, thoughts? You can ask things about me, the presentation, share your own experience of if you've worked in this field or related, whatever you got on your mind.
So I guess one question that pops up for me is, let's say you are working with, well, you wouldn't be working, but let's say that a parent is negligent and the kid is acting out and stuff like that. How do you get involved? So who's the supporting system that would encourage the kid to go to therapy or seek help, especially when they don't have that, parental figure?
All right. Yeah, thank you. Important piece I didn't even mention in collaborating, caregivers and parents. Absolutely. So you would be able to identify, hopefully, caregivers in a youth's life that could be part of the treatment approach. When I worked in residential treatment, the caregivers were, we had a few sources of caregivers. They might have been the milieu staff that spent the most time with youth in the cottages where they were living. But we still engage the parents, because even if youth are removed from their homes due to abuse and neglect, you have to do a little research, because the family, there might be a desire to reunify that family. And so it becomes very important to engage the parents in that kind of work. A lot of times parents also get referred to engage in services themselves so that they can better engage in the support of the child as well. Does that help you, Simona?
Yeah, absolutely. And do you ever get like pushbacks from your personal experience by parents or parents that don't want to cooperate with you?
Sure. Yeah. So absolutely, there can be, that therapeutic relationship with the parents is just as important as it is with the child. And so something I find in child welfare, though, that I would caution everybody about is you don't want to get in a situation when a child's been removed from their home where the child is seen as this is a victim, but the child is the victim and the parents are somehow demonized. Because if you're a clinician and you're holding on to that, you're just holding it. I know that you're not going to say those things out loud, but if you're feeling it, if it's part of that, you yourself, the clinician, could be creating a situation in which parents aren't going to cooperate with you, maybe some of their own stuff, but it's interacting now with your own stuff as the clinician.
Yeah. Okay. Appreciate it.
Dr. Benton, I have a question on the chat from Amber. Can you go over the negative effects of the brain overproducing cortisol and adrenaline over time?
Yes, I can briefly. So yes, over time, we know that cortisol and adrenaline cascading and it throughout your body does cause a disease process. So it will negatively impact organ systems. So you can see a rise in stroke, heart attack, diabetes, obesity. And so, yes, cortisol does have a negative impact on organ systems over time. And so they will not function as well.
How would you kind of approach working with a colleague who, like a patient's like social worker or doctor, who maybe aren't acknowledging like complex trauma and only see that in like that child or that juvenile is just like aggressive and acting out and like really not accounting for the trauma they've gone through?
Oh, great question. Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, this can be hard, right? Because our youth are always interacting with adults, and sometimes they're very tough, right? The relationship itself can be hard. So you start having professionals sort of developing their own thoughts and feelings, reactions, or impressions to what this is really about. So I'll go back to something common thread through my presentation. It's about the relationship. And so developing cooperative, collaborative, interested and curious, informative relationships with other providers over time. And this is the part that people get a little impatient with, because you want to have one meeting with the psychiatrist and the psychiatrist says, okay, I see it your way. Well, we know that's not how it works. And we're not wired that way either. So it's, yes, I think it's good collaborative working, mutual relationships back and forth. So a lot of times I'm just asking, hey, what's your impression of this youth? Help me understand how you see this youth. And then I'll say something like, could I float something your way? I just have something I want to share, and I just want to hear your feedback on it, right? And so these are conversations that evolve over time, and we have to make time. Anybody else?
How do you account for like in juveniles protective factors versus like a maladaptive trauma response that you like genuinely have to help them work on?
When you say, how do I account for, what do you mean?
Like within their treatment plan, like sorry.
Right. So there's a difference. Well, there's a gray area here in this field between, when we talk survival strategies, are we really talking resilience, or is resilience different than survival strategies? So you'll see this blurry in the field. But if you help a youth see the way that they navigated as a survival strategy, you can talk about how this helped them get through the unsafe thing, so that it's a strength because you survived, you got here. And where does it work and where does it not work anymore in your life? So I'm not going to dismantle a youth survival strategy. I'm going to say, where does it work still? Where do you still need this? Where does it not work anymore? But then I'm also taking a look at these protective factors or resiliency factors. And we're pulling those in and we're naming them. We're talking about them out loud. Hey, I noticed you do this. Anybody ever tell you that's pretty amazing? That seems like something that we should talk more about and unpack. And how can this help you moving forward? Yeah. Yeah, occasionally I'll get these assessments, and under the strengths portion of the assessment, I kid you not, they'll be written none. I'm like, whoops, we got to go back and do a little bit more work here. I don't think that's true. Anything else?
I know we have some prospective students on the call, so if there's any questions even about the program, I'm happy to answer those as well. Otherwise, I will put my contact information and a link to my Calendly. If you'd like to meet one-on-one to discuss the program, I'm happy to do that as well.
Dr. Benton, can we share your presentation to prospective students? Okay.
Yeah, do you, would I send you the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I can do that, no problem.
Great.
Anybody else? I'm okay with you marinating on the discussion a little bit. Maybe something will come to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Benton, for presenting for our current and prospective students.
Thank you. I really do enjoy this. And yeah, I look forward to maybe meeting some of you in person at some point. But yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Have a good
Thank
day,
you.
everybody.